Thanks a lot, Kevin, and good morning, everyone. Nice, fun way to start off a Monday with a bunch of people in a room who care about kids, a bunch of folks in a room who think about how do we really reimagine our public schools, how do we think about innovation in a very, very different way, and let's kind of use our collective creativity and passion and belief to drive change for our kids, which is ultimately the reason I do this work. And when you think about any aspect of a school, whether it's the building, the classroom, the people, it's all focused on one thing, which is how do we make sure every single child can be inspired and motivated and believed in and given the skills that they need to have a chance at a great future, right? That's the foundation of what we're trying to get done in public education. So very grateful to be here, and I want to thank Scott Himmelstein, who's a phenomenal education leader who connected me to the event today. And I also want to take a second and thank Matt Wonder and Superintendent Johnstone. For those of you who aren't, I imagine you are because you're here, but who aren't as aware of what's happening, not just in this building, but really between Da Vinci Schools and Wiseburn, I really think we are at the central point of innovation in California right here in this building. Because when you think about how do you leverage a building and a space and a design to best support the development of our young people and to best support the curriculum, it's happening right here. You know, if you think about how do you actually really shift what's going on in a classroom, because that's where the action ultimately is, and how do you shift that relationship between teachers and students and move our schools into the 21st century, that is happening right here. And if you really think about how does a school district and a charter school organization really work as creatively and entrepreneurially as possible to put the very, very best schools forward for kids, that's what this space is. So be sure if you don't know them well, get some of their time during the breaks because they just do wonderful work. So thank you so much for hosting us today. I've got about 25 minutes. I'm going to spend about 10 throwing some thoughts out there, and then we'll go into a broader conversation. And Kevin said, hey, we're going to match reality with our ideas and creativity to try to figure out how we move forward. So I'm gonna start by spending a little time on the reality, because it's always important to know where are we today, and then talk through a little bit about, I think, some ideas for where we can go in the future and sneak in a little bit of my background in between so you can get a better sense of who's talking in front of you. But as we're all sitting here today, there are 6.2 million kids in public schools in the state of California, and over 3 million cannot read and write at grade level. Right? That's happening right here. And there's a lot of practitioners in the room, but some folks who are. I just want to make sure we level set. And you think about it and close your eyes and think about, in a 21st century economy, a knowledge-based economy, the most competitive economy in the history of humankind, over 3 million kids can't read and write at grade level. What does that mean for their future? It really means, in many ways, it ends before it even begins. We are the technology capital of the world. I believe we're the creativity capital of the world. And right now in the state of California, our fourth graders rank dead last in science in terms of achievement in the country. Great state of California. Creativity capital of the world, dead last in science. We've been able to create Google and Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Apple, but we're not able to teach our kids science. Like that is a collective failure. Fourth grade reading, we're 48th in the country. And take a guess where we were 25 years ago. We're 48th in the country right now in fourth grade reading. Take a guess where we were 25 years ago. Take a guess. Give me some guesses. Fire away. One, go ahead. First, what else? 48th? So first and 48th. Those are the two guesses we got. 50 years ago, we were first and third and fifth. 50s, 60s, early 70s. 25 years ago, we were 49th. So we've been stuck at the bottom for a couple decades, and somehow we've kind of become collectively numb to failure and mediocrity in our schools, and we have to ask ourselves, how is this possible in the wealthiest state in the nation? How is this possible when we have so many great kids? And how is this possible when we have a lot of educators working really, really hard? How are we not getting the job done? We're here at a conference thinking about kind of innovation in the future, and we're not even getting started here. And there's a lot of reasons, but I really believe one of the biggest is this state has not prioritized its public schools, and our elected officials haven't gotten the job done on public education. And you think about it at a macro level, we were amongst, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when we were amongst the best public schools, we were 7th in per pupil funding. So in 1977, we were 7th in the country in how we spent on our kids, and we're 41st. So kind of our elected officials have allowed us to go towards the bottom. We've also dramatically underinvested in our teachers and principals along the way. And then lastly, we've created this huge book called the California Education Code, which is literally 2,500 pages. It's like 4-point font. And it really takes creativity and innovation out of the hands of educators. It really takes kind of entrepreneurism out of our schools. And we've got to shift that dynamic so we have a lot more creativity and collaboration and energy going on in our schools. There's a school, a private school not too far from here in Watts, called Verm Day, which is a really creative Catholic school. And on Fridays, their juniors and seniors have internships. And they kind of build that back in their curriculum Monday through Thursday. And you can't do that in traditional public schools in the state of California because of that education code, right? Something that just makes a ton of sense for the 21st century. And so we have to shift these fundamentals that don't work for our kids. Not enough funding, way too much kind of regulation, and not enough creativity and innovation. And for that to happen, a big step is we actually have to change the politics of education, because the decisions around how much we spend on our schools, the decisions around, are we going to take all this in collective energy that, I mean, you are on the forefront of thinking about what should schools actually be versus what they are, and how do you kind of leverage this great combination of design of a school, integration of different partnerships from outside of school, high quality professional development for teachers and principals, all focused on educating kids, addressing academic and social emotional supports. Like, you're on the forefront of that. For us to get there collectively, you got to change the politics of education while obviously in parallel changing the practices. And that's ultimately why I left my prior jobs, which I loved, which was running schools, in order to drive change in the politics of education. Kevin mentioned it briefly in terms of my work in education. So I was lucky enough in my 20s. I started not in education. I was in education. I was sitting in my 20s. I was working in finance and technology. And lucky enough, as I was growing up and maturing and get a better sense of who I was, I'm like, I got to do stuff I'm passionate about and I care about. I was raised in a pretty faith-influenced household, and the ideals of service and helping other people were really ingrained in me, and I felt like my job had very little to do with that. And I said, I want to go work on something that's helping people have a better life, and nothing better than public education in this state, in this country. So I did a little bit of teaching, but ultimately got my start full-time, helped create a group called Greened Up Public Schools, which is a nonprofit based here in LA, opening charter schools in Inglewood, South LA, East LA, helped open 10 new schools. 8 of those 10 schools recognized by US News and World Report amongst the better high schools in the country, all serving high-need kids. Left Green Dot in 2007 to go work in district public schools, because that's where the vast majority of kids are, and that's where I wanted to focus, and help create a group called the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, which is a really unique innovation here in LA, where the school district and the mayor said, for our lowest performing schools, let's all work together to turn those around. And so we essentially created a school district within LA Unified, 15,000 kids, 18 schools, just focused on turning around the lowest 5% schools in LA. And for those folks that aren't as close to the work, I want to give you like lowest 5% schools. Think about Santee High School, which we started work with in 2008. In 2008, Santee High School had 3,500 students at the school and 35 at grade level in math out of 3,500. Markham Middle School in the heart of Watts, a middle school, 12-year-old kids, 13-year-old kids, had a 30% suspension rate. Like, there's no school has any business ever suspending any kid, much less a 12-year-old, at a 30% rate. And you could see kind of amongst our kids, wonderful kids, but you could see that like lack of hope, shoulders slumped, eyes towards the ground, lack of possibility. And so we collectively said, we don't accept this, we have to drive change. And the change has to happen comprehensively. We raised more money for our schools. We recruited phenomenal principals to come work in Watts and East LA and South LA and paid them more money. We actually gave them a lot more room to be leaders and to be entrepreneurial, invested a lot in our teachers. That's where the foundation of the work is. Found the most effective teachers, gave them room during their day to coach and mentor their peers. Brought technology to our schools, revamped the curriculum to make sure that students actually had both access to strong college prep and also strong access to some career tech, and making sure you actually had a good, robust curriculum. Engaged in a lot of different partnerships How do you actually make sure our kids can see what is the world outside of their walls? How do you actually make the walls within the school make more sense to them? We had a lot of our kids, whether it be summer internships, after school, et cetera. We had some companies that sent a bus every week to our school so our kids could come to their companies and learn what were the different jobs that those organizations actually had at all different levels of the organization. And we got our parents involved, launched a parent college on Saturdays, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. I share this because just to give you a sense of we have to collectively work in our schools at all levels, curriculum, people, design, connections to career and possibilities with families and community to make the most sense for our kids. Our graduation rates were 36% when we started. They're 81% today, right? So that shows what's possible for our young people. But we have to make big changes across this entire state. And I believe strongly it starts with making public education the top policy priority in the state of California, right? Like this state has prioritized other policy issues if you think about it, right? We said we're going to lead the way in the climate crisis and didn't know exactly how to pay for it, and now we're leading the way on emission standards and renewables. When Affordable Care Act came out, we said we're going to lead the way on getting insurance to the uninsured, and Covered California didn't exist, didn't know how to do it, but we chose collectively and politically to address that issue, and now we're leading the way on getting healthcare out there. It's time for California to lead the way on public education and to go from being 48th, today to 10th, 5th, first over the next decade. That's what we have to get to. And a huge piece of it is the work that you all are kind of thinking about and leading and designing, which is what should schools actually look like, not just visually, but practically in the 21st century? What should the schools be today? And we think about to move forward collectively, you got to focus on 4 big areas. First is heavy investment in teachers and principals. Second, moving our schools actually to the 21st century. Third, fully funding our schools. And fourth, actually serving all kids. So I'll touch on each one briefly, a little more time on the 21st century schools, given this audience, and then we'll jump in for some conversation. But you always have to start with teachers and principals, because the foundation of a school is that relationship between student and teacher, and the principals that support that. That's the foundation. And yet we don't treat our teachers and our principals well, right? So think about the value proposition for a teacher today in the state of California. I'm not going to pay you very much. I'm not going to train you very well. And I'm going to blame you for what's going on in our public schools. And you wonder why we have a teacher shortage in the state of California, right? You have to fundamentally shift that equation entirely, which is over time, we got to give more compensation to our educators. You got to pay them more so they can at least buy a house somewhere near where they teach. I think we should do free college for anybody who commits to teaching for 5 years. And we have to train our teachers differently. And this is right in the wheelhouse of a lot of today's conversation. Technology has moved forward so fast in this world. The things we do every day have changed dramatically, and yet our teacher training programs are still relatively similar to what they were 30 years ago. So we want to really think about how do you kind of almost break down the walls of a classroom. You bring a lot more innovation into curriculum, inside a classroom, outside of a classroom. You got a really thoughtful innovation. You got to also help make sure our educators, our teachers and principals have the skills to help do that. And so when we think about innovation and design for a conversation like today, we have to make sure we're bringing our principals and our teachers and even our superintendents to some extent along for that. So we have to do a lot more investment in training and shift the way we're training our professionals, remind them what it feels like to be innovative and creative and entrepreneurial. Second, we got to move our schools in the 21st century. And think about how many kids, of those 6.2 million kids, the majority are still sitting in classrooms where you're in a desk for 6 to 8 hours with someone talking to you every day, right? That makes zero sense in the 21st century. What are the skills we need? Collaboration skills, creativity, problem solving. Those are the things, projects, working with people on projects. That's what's going to be really appreciated, respected, and frankly employed today and tomorrow. And those are the skills that have to change. So how do you fundamentally shift the dynamics where, computer science isn't just like a once in a while class where kids have it nonstop, where high schools are really redesigned, where you're integrating college prep and career development in a very, very different way, where kids are outside the classroom on a pretty regular basis, where you're actually giving principals and teachers a lot more creativity, where foreign language, which we know is helpful from an employability perspective, we know kids learn it much better at age 5, 6, and 7, but we still require at age 15, 16, and 17, and don't give it to most kids when they can actually learn languages the fastest, right? We got to move our schools in the 21st century. And that, to me, starts with the education code and getting, really frankly, a lot of the regulations you find in the state education code to give district schools a lot more flexibility, like charters actually already have, so you can be much more creative and innovative. So when you're working together, if you're a practitioner in your district or a partner who works with districts on that key question they were able to do here, how do you integrate design, curriculum, professional development in the most effective way for kids? Let's give educators the most room to do that and really decrease that flexibility and have a heavy investment in innovation. It's a huge state. What the state should be doing is funding innovation all over the state, and rather than being like a big bureaucracy, be a phenomenal organization to find out what is working in different schools and school districts, where is the innovation, why is it working, and then how do you scale that across the state and share those best practices. That should be the fundamental job of what's called the California Department of Education, which reports up to the state superintendent, which is way too bureaucratic, way too compliance driven. It should be phenomenal at learning. Funding innovative projects, let the practitioners soar, let the kids be successful, learn what worked in a school district, different area, and then scale that and share that throughout the state. Third, we got to fully fund our schools. We can't have the best public schools in the country if we're 41st in funding. That doesn't work that way, especially when we have the highest population of kids in poverty when you adjust for cost of living of any state in the country. And then lastly, we need to really serve all kids. I believe public education is a great equalizer, but if it's not working for all kids, it can't be the great equalizer. And our special needs students, our African American males, our English learners, our foster kids, these student populations have just not been well served by our public schools, really probably ever, certainly not for decades. And so we got to shift those things. And when you take a step back, that's a lot, right? We got to invest in our teachers and principals, move our schools to the 21st century, fully fund our schools, and we got to also really ensure we're putting in place policies that impact all kids. But there's one more thing we need to do to change our public schools, and that's really get involved in the politics of education, which is where a lot of people don't want to play, but that's where you have to play if you want to get that education code decreased. It's where you have to play if you really want to unlock the creativity and innovation that sits in the hearts of our kids and our principals and all the folks that work around schools and our teachers. You got to get involved in that. So I have one question before I finish and ask folks to be honest. Raise your hand if you can name your school board member, your state assembly member, your state senator, and your state superintendent. If you can name all four, not just one or two, all four of those positions, please raise your hand and raise it high. Okay, so keep it up for a second. Keep it up. Everyone look around. I see 5 hands, 6 hands out of this group of, almost 100, right, that can name those 4 positions. And everything you're going to talk about today in terms of improving schools, the policies that dictate whether or not that can happen, those 4 people plus the governor make those decisions politically about whether there's going to be more flexibility for real innovation, whether we're going to actually fund our schools the way they should be funded. Those 4 positions plus the governor make those calls. And so unless the public, particularly folks that work closer to schools, get more involved in understanding those positions and push our elected leaders to say, we need more innovation in our schools. We need more creativity. We need more unique partnerships like you see between Wiseburn and Da Vinci up and down the state. And unless you do that, it will not change. And we'll have nice creative little pilot projects here or there, but we won't have what we know we can have as a state, which is wonderful, robust, enriching, innovative, exciting, aspirational public schools for every single child in the state of California. And so when we think about kind of matching reality with vision, we keep pushing us as hard as possible on what is possible. And then also make sure get involved in the hard work too of pushing those leaders to enable us to do what's possible for our kids. Because we all know if we step up for our kids, they soar, they respond, and they're successful, and they'll push the limits of our innovation. Like all the stuff we're thinking about, innovative and creative schools, they'll take it 5 times further if we really unlock their passion, their hearts, and their creativity. And we know it's possible, so let's get it done together. So with that, I think I'll pause, and we'll have any questions that folks have.
So we've got about 7 minutes for a little Q&A. We can put the thought exchange up, but as we do that, let's take a question or a comment or a thought from the audience. So if we think about all the things that impact us, the connecting the dots, policy is a big deal. Someone who would like to offer a question up to Marshall or has a comment from the audience. Who'd like to go?
Right behind you.
Oh, yes, please.
Can you talk a little bit about the broader struggle between charter sectors and district and how it's impacting the landscape in California?
So the question was broader impact of like the struggle between charters and district and how it impacts the landscape of California. I think, I'll say landscape within education, because like outside of folks who are kind of close to schools, this like real deep tension of charter district, you don't hear as much about it from, let's call it the general public, the folks that actually aren't in schools or connected to schools. So I just remind people of that because sometimes we get there's so much kind of challenges there. In some districts, certainly in LA, there is kind of a real tension. First, let's start with the facts. 91% of kids in public schools in California are in district public schools. 9% are in charters, so it's still the vast majority of kids are in district public schools. Charter school law was passed in 1992. The intent was, how do you actually allow another organization, besides a district, to run a public school, particularly in a case where the district's not, like a certain function is not being performed by the traditional district schools, whether it be high poverty schools, which is where I've worked, where we just haven't gotten the job done for a long time, or unique innovation, right? The idea was supposed to be charters were supposed to be innovative. Unfortunately, the idea was always a good thing. The idea was always around collaboration, like how do you actually have charters be a part of a public school system? Unfortunately, in certain districts, it's just like charter or district school rather than one public education system that has a lot of district schools, that has some magnet schools, and also has some charter schools, but all with one focus. And so part of what I want to help kind of push, and you certainly see this is the gold standard here with Weisburn and Da Vinci, but how does state leadership help decrease the fighting and kind of increase the collaboration? One, as I mentioned, is sharing best practices. So there's very few district superintendents, and there's very few charter school leaders in the state that know what's happening right here. Very few. Which doesn't make sense because this is just a phenomenal collaboration. So that's where the state should be sharing what's working on these in terms of collaboration. Secondly, there's some pretty easy policy because there are some challenges with some charters, like for-profit charter schools, we should just not accept them in California. Charters should be completely transparent. Most are, some aren't. And so actually like things like the Brown Act that going to allow for more transparency. And then the state also needs to be a little more aggressive about working with school districts to shut down ineffective charters. If charters aren't performing a function the district can't, so if the district schools aren't, better than the district schools, not better comprehensively, but in terms of academically and graduation rates, or not uniquely innovative, then you got to think about, okay, then what's the purpose it's actually serving? And then we got to think about how do you actually drive much more collaboration. I think nonprofit charter schools, particularly in high-need areas, have a real role to play in public schools, but they're part of a public education system. It's not two different systems, and this is a perfect example of that. And ideally, if we do our jobs, in 10 years, you'll see much more of this, where folks see the collective benefit rather than this conflict.
So Marshall, if we could take also a question then from Thought Exchange, thinking about that ecosystem, right? The system of education. Very interesting. One of our colleagues asks, how do we engage and partner with the private sector to support curriculum, to support the future of learning? They note there's an enormous gap between schools and the real world of work. What's your vision to bringing the real world into the ecosystem with the schools? Yeah,
then also specific examples from my experience and what I've seen, and then also some higher level thoughts. So we, like the Partnership for Schools, the whole concept was district plus city plus philanthropic and private sector focused on the lowest performing schools. So we had tons of different partnerships with the private sector to help bring real supports to our kids that ranged from, we had a pretty large, well-known consulting company run an entrepreneurial class for our students where a lot of kids were actually able to go and learn about how to build a business and actually write a business plan and actually go and carry that out. And they connected them to specific professionals in that field. It just there's no reason we don't have that across the board for so many different schools. I mentioned briefly, we had Fox Sports West, which was close geographically to one of our schools in South LA, where they literally had our kids go every week, and we rotated different kids to see all the different jobs that went behind putting on a Lakers game, or a Clippers actually, which was Fox Sports West. Like they could see it from the CEO of the company to actually the engineering behind the scoreboard, to the sales and marketing and everything in between. And that's where giving our kids real access. And then how do you integrate more actual career tech into the school itself? So one of our schools, we actually had a strong program for solar panel installation. kind of a growing job in the future, and you got to make sure that your principals prioritize partnerships. That's what I mentioned earlier. Like, you need to develop the capacity so principals realize, hey, we need to partner with the private sector. It brings more opportunities to our kids and the teachers as well. And then we had staff members. Like, school districts should hire people whose job it is to connect private sector to schools. Because you just kind of leave it up to the school and the company. Oftentimes, they don't actually know how to work with each other or speak the same language. So we, at the partnership schools, we had a 6-person team that was just focused on connecting creative partnerships to our educators and helping to facilitate that. At the highest level, what I'd like to see in California is governor, state soup, and legislature work with industry to really try to say, what do we think is our best guess, and it's going to be a guess, but our best guess on what are the jobs in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years in this state, and then backwards map that both with our community colleges and our pre-K through 12 system to see, are we actually teaching the skills that line up with those jobs? And there's some real work to be done there.
Excellent. I know you have to get on to the real world and your next stop. Please, can we have a huge round of applause? Marshall Tuck, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.